How does a 22-year-old man end up fighting for the Army of Northern Virginia and somehow makes it all the way to Appomattox to be one of 72 surviving members of a unit from North Carolina? Today, we're going to retrace the steps of Peter Crawford Earnhardt, the very man that his survival of the American Civil War would birth a NASCAR dynasty in Dale Earnhardt and his family. We'll take you on the trail to 20th North Carolina right here in Malvern Hill. So we're back at Malvern Hill again, and this time it's to go over that story we talked about earlier in the summer about Peter Crawford Earnhardt. We're going to take you around this field and kind of show you some of the unique features that this man had to cross over. And it's no different really than a lot of Civil War battlefields. A lot of rolling hills, trees, houses, structures that are in the way, and a huge artillery duel that happens in the middle of this battle. But what's unique about this story, when we talk about Peter Crawford Earnhardt, is the fact that this is a 22-year-old man that somehow there's no record of him ever being wounded. There's no record of him being captured. He is a survivalist. He fights in the American Civil War at a place right here across from me on that field, coming in this direction towards that Thomas J. West house. Now this West house isn't the original structure that was out here. It's probably likely that the original structure is inside with pieces of the wood from the original house, or was torn down and rebuilt to look like it is today, which is a dilapidated house that's no longer in use and is owned by the Park Service. But Peter Crawford comes across this field over here facing the artillery fire that's all along this ridgeline. Now there are horror stories out here at Malvern Hill of men that are having their heads blown off, their legs taken out from underneath them, their brothers being gutted right here next to them. And somehow Earnhardt makes it through this battle. And this is at the very beginning of the American Civil War, really. But he goes on to fight in many other places. Union gunboats on the James River actually fired projectiles right here in Malvern Hill over top of the Confederate soldiers coming across this field. Here on History with Waffles, we're going to take you out here to this field and talk about it. And we're going to kind of highlight some of the features around the field that the artillerists used in order to fight this fight and create a massive Union victory against Confederate soldiers charging across Malvern Hill. I've covered the story of Malvern Hill pretty extensively on the channel, And other channels like American Battlefield Trust have also covered this story pretty good. But did you know that the gunboats on the James River actually fired overhead here at the Battle of Malvern Hill? This location right behind me. Artillery played a major important role here in this battle. Let's do a little battlefield orientation out here. Directly off in front of me here is a Confederate position, and they would have been coming in this direction towards Malvern Hill. And they're lined up all along the tree line here. They're back down in this direction, down on the hillside, and they're all coming up and concentrating in this area. You also have artillery from the Confederates over here, artillery from the Confederates over here, and they're trying to get crossfire into this position and knock out as many guns and reserve soldiers as possible. And you can see the guns all throughout here that the park is set up to kind of give you that visual of what this battlefield would look like and what you would have been approaching if you were a Confederate soldier out here on this field. Coming from that position over there, here it doesn't look like much. But you start at the top of a hill and you start to march, and then you start going down. You can see a little valley right there in the middle, and then you start to pop back over top of this hill. And then eventually, the cannonballs that are flying overhead and some of the short range stuff is actually knocking the heads off of the soldiers before they get to this position right over here, which is a road, a historic road that travels through Malvern Hill and runs up in this direction. And soldiers are using that and enslaved quarters that used to be out here as protection for themselves when they were coming up through this position. Over here, it's less prominent, the valley, because it goes off down in the woods and you can't really see it that much. What we're going to do now is we're going to cross over this farm field, which is usually leased out and farmers are allowed to farm out here. It makes for a much better scene on this battlefield during the summertime. But we're going to cross over this flat open field, and we're going to kind of take a look at the terrain, and I'm going to show you as I'm walking along. This field is freshly plowed field, usually right before the season when corn season comes up, and they plant their crops out here. Right now it's chopped down. All of the plants were cut down, all the rows of plants, and they've mowed it out pretty good. And they're going to turn this back into another farm field here pretty soon. But this gives us the opportunity to walk this land and to be able to see what this terrain looks like from the perspective of a soldier. And you can see that I'm kind of crossing over here and heading down towards that valley that's in front of us. And I'm going to make my way down there. When we get there, I'm going to flip that camera around from one of the lowest points in the valley, and we're going to make our way back across towards those guns that we were just at Malvern Hill. Now, I wanted to make sure to turn this around so you can see the position that I'm coming from. And you can see kind of the guns back here in the background, just over my shoulder. And the artillery position would have been placed out there. Also, there would have been guns in reserve in that field. There would have been thousands and thousands of Union soldiers in support. Thousands of soldiers that are just over that hill, over here where that house is. And they are basically standing by, ready to go into the fight. And the soldiers are meeting each other out here. But the Confederates, they never quite make it to that hill. There was one point where the Confederates got real close in this direction right over here, real close to the artillery position, but they never really quite made it. Wasn't like Gettysburg. I do like to compare it to Gettysburg all the time because of the open field of fire, the head-on charges, and how the Confederates were basically demolished out here on this field. But unlike Gettysburg, there was no high watermark pivotal point for these soldiers when they came across this field. They didn't make it to the stone wall, if you will. So it's a pretty deadly fight out here at Malvern Hill. And a lot of the soldiers had to move on to the next location. And unfortunately, there's not a whole lot written in diaries and letters that you can find, but there is a few things. So now looking back in the opposite direction here, you can see the house, which became, there was a smaller version of that house here during the American Civil War up on that hill. And that became a focus point for soldiers from the Confederacy and the artillery. along with the Union artillery, which you can kind of see off in the distance there on the ridge line ahead of us. But from this perspective, where we are kind of at a low point in this trail, you can see the uphill grade of this hill. And when you first get here, it's kind of hard to determine where you're at and what you're doing. Because even though this field is wide open, you really don't know what the terrain looks like unless you cross it. And you can see all this bramble and brush out here that's not being plowed. Up over the top, when I put this camera up high, maybe you can make out the terrain features there a little bit. And you can see a little bit of what these guys were having to go through in order to cross this field. And once you get to a certain point out here on this field, it's almost like a protective cover. And it takes a heck of a lot more courage to come across this field from that protective position in the low-lying area when you get up and you start moving towards this spot. Now, there were things written about that location over there, because roughly in that spot is where Jamison, the young soldier that's pictured during the Ken Burns documentary, that's where he lost his life, roughly, is what they think. Also, soldiers laid down flat over there in those roads to protect themselves. And they hugged the earth right out here. I also did a story out here in Malvern Hill about another Confederate soldier who lost his brother here. He was from Norfolk, and he ends up fighting in the Battle of Gettysburg and becoming a prisoner of war out there in Gettysburg. Well, his brother ends up losing his life somewhere in this area. And that soldier also hugs the earth out here. And there's another soldier that writes a letter talking about hugging the earth and watching the projectiles fire overhead of him, just within reach of him. If he stands up, he could put his arms up and touch a projectile as it goes across, although he didn't. He did talk about it. All right, I kind of wanted to zoom this thing out a little bit and then kind of walk it around in a circle so you can see with me in the picture where I'm at right now. And I'm at that low-lying point where that brush is that was in that first initial video that we took out here. And this is a cleared path that you can take to go all the way across the length of the field to the other side right behind me here. And we're going to head back in the opposite direction here towards artillery, and we'll talk a little bit about that artillery and what these Confederates were facing here. All right, making our way back across this field. So when the soldiers were marching up in this direction, it's not a clear, beautiful day like it is today with nice, peaceful sounds all around. The cannons ahead were causing hell for these soldiers coming across this field. They weren't just aiming at the artillery positions on the opposite side. Some of them were aiming pretty low because they wanted to affect the lines that were coming through here. And those projectiles were actually knocking massive holes in the lines, which were being plugged and filled by the lines that were directly in the rear of the lines heading in this direction. Another thing that these Confederate soldiers had to worry about were the gunboats sitting in the James River. Now, there's not a lot said about that because they didn't have a massive effect on the fight out here. But there were 3 gunboats that are out there, and they moved up the river as soon as they heard that there was a fight here at Malvern Hill, and they knew something was going on. Those gunboats started to fire their massive projectiles overhead, and they exploded with huge power, sending fire and all kinds of stuff in the air, and obviously affecting the morale of the soldiers on the ground who were worried about being killed by those projectiles. But nonetheless, the projectiles that they did fire out here didn't have very much of an effect on the fight. What really had an effect was the men stationed out here and the artillery station over here. John Porter ends up taking charge of the artillery out here, and Henry Hunt's positioning of everything really sets the stage for what we have. John Porter was kind of a genius at this fight, and the positioning of these artillery pieces gave them this open, beautiful view of fire, this field of fire all across behind me here. And I can see from the position where I was, that line of bramble there, the Confederates coming from that direction, the same direction that I'm walking right now. Just imagine being out here and those cannons opening up. I don't think, from what I've read, I think the Confederates got to about right here. And this was it. This was the extent of their fight. They couldn't go any further because they had those cannons firing and bearing down on top of them. And then eventually, they had to make their way safely back across this field, and usually under the cover of darkness. Because once you stick your head back up, not only are you worried about the cannons ahead of us here, but you're worried about the rifles that are also aiming at you as you're coming across. So this is not a very close distance between us and that cannon sitting right over there. We're talking maybe a football field's length that these Confederate soldiers are able to make it to this position. Also, we have Ames out in front of us, and we'll go over there and talk about the soldiers that were in that location. That's enough of me talking. We're going to go ahead and head on across this field for the last little bit and just kind of let you listen to the sounds of the terrain and watch the view. Last of the Civil War generals to die, Adelbert Ames. On the sign here, it talks about during the afternoon of July 1st, this battery fired 1,392 rounds of shell and canister. Most devastating was the canister. Shotgun-like blasts of iron balls fired at short range. The Confederate infantry melted away under the barrage. No Southerners reached the guns. This is the position where that 5th U.S. artillery was firing from. Adelbert Ames of Company A would have been out here, manning these guns and leading those men. Artillery pieces like the one that's in front of me right here is what Earnhardt's facing. If you take a look at the across this vast open field, this is a farmland. It's always been a farmland out through here. And there's a paved road that runs down this area here, and it branches off. It goes off in that direction and then off in this direction here. The 20th North Carolina is coming from that tree line over there, and they're heading in this direction. They formed way off in the distance before they started making their way across this field toward the position that we're at right now. They are unsuccessful in trying to make it right here at the artillery line here at Malvern Hill in front of the West House. Now beyond that house right there, all off in the distance, Thomas J. West House, beyond the ridge line there is another farm. That farm actually has thousands of Union soldiers crammed in there in reserves waiting to come up and fight in this direction. And many of them do. For example, the 67th New York is over there. they're lined up and ready to come up into the fight. And just as the 20th North Carolina comes off the line over there, the 67th comes into the fray. Now, just a couple of days before that, there's a young lieutenant, a second lieutenant, who's a part of the 67th New York, and he's fighting off at Nelson's farm over here, and he manages to get himself into a world of hurt. And he tells a story in 1866 to another man who writes it down for him about how he was crossing a field and artillery took his calf muscle right off of his leg. That's the kind of stuff that these guys are facing out here. That very injury took that second lieutenant completely out of the fight for the rest of the American Civil War. And somehow, Peter Crawford does not end up with an injury out here on this field at Malvern Hill. Earnhardt's born in February of 1839, and he is born to a farming family in Cabarrus County. I believe it's the way you say it. And today, I believe it's called Kannapolis, in North Carolina. At the age of 22, he ends up enlisting in 1861 and finds himself in the 20th North Carolina. From there, they end up pushing their way north and end up in the Army of Northern Virginia. This is how Peter Crawford becomes one of the men that's fighting here at Malvern Hill, by enlisting in 1861 and simply just by chance. A lot of men from North Carolina enlist in the Confederate Army, and a lot of them get separated in different directions. Just to give you an example, in Yancey County, North Carolina, multiple units were enlisting at the exact same time. Half of those units ended up in the Army of Tennessee, and the other half would end up being units that were in Gettysburg, some of the most famous units from Gettysburg, or infamous, I should say, because of how many people were lost, killed, or wounded there at Gettysburg. Now here in just a second, I'm going to turn this camera around, and we are going to walk the path roughly the path that Peter Crawford Earnhardt would have had to have taken to come across this field with the 20th North Carolina, facing the artillery ahead of me here. And we're also talking about the sun is starting to get lower in the sky. So he's involved in that too. This isn't one of those situations where they're fighting in the bright of day and it's 8 o'clock in the morning and they have all day to fight. They push off about 1, 2 o'clock in the afternoon when they first start getting engaged. They're not done until that sun starts going down in the sky. And even then, they have to worry about the artillery firing overhead towards that tree line and crashing into them as they're hiding behind the lines of the trees. Now we're headed off in this direction, where realistically, more of Magruder's men would have probably been out here on this field. And off to the right-hand side, that's where the Alabamians are, that's where the Virginians are, that we talked about in a previous video when we did a two-part series on John Vermillion and his brother fighting out here, and then eventually John Vermillion making his way to Gettysburg to fight over there. Well, the man we're talking about today also fought in Gettysburg. And when they made their way to Gettysburg, the 20th North Carolina would end up with something like 56% casualties at that battlefield, which is a really high number, especially considering how many of them were left. By the time they make it to Gettysburg, there's not a whole lot of them left. Somewhere in the neighborhood of just over 300, maybe close to 400 men are still in the ranks at Gettysburg. And after that, even less. But it's after Gettysburg that the 20th North Carolina ends up finding themselves in the dispatches of Robert E. Lee when he talks about their bravery and tenacity in capturing a flag and fighting well after the Battle of Gettysburg. It's pretty amazing for any single person to be listed in those dispatches, and an entire unit to be mentioned means that something significant had to happen in order for him to write back to the authorities ahead of him or over him about that. So this was a unit filled with people who were brave and tireless and fought right up till the end of the war. Now that we've got this camera turned around, I'm going to walk you through a path coming from the Union position, because we talked about the 67th New York earlier, but we also have units like the 61st over here. We also have Pennsylvania units, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. They're all off in this direction. These are the men that the 20th North Carolina are facing. This is the men that the Confederacy has to deal with over here in this position. And they are tough men. They are fighters, and they are ready for this fight out here. But also, look at the terrain from the direction of the Union soldiers. When they are coming from here, they are facing an uphill battle. As you can see with the terrain directly in front of me here, the field rolls. It goes up, and then it goes back down. These men are having to deal with this terrain difference. And this is a farm field in the middle of July, or the very beginning, really. There is all kinds of stuff out here that's really getting in the path of what they have to do in order to fight this fight. So here we are now at kind of like the crest, the ridge line, the height of this hill that we were just walking down. And look across the field here behind me. This is amazing. We're at a high point here on this side of the road. If you go to the other side of the road, that's not a high point, it's a low point. Just on the opposite side of this road here is where the Confederates were actually laying down in a divot to keep themselves from being hit by cannonballs that were flying over their head. Artillery over here has a clear open shot of anything coming from this direction. So if you have soldiers that are marching across this field trying to fight you, you're going to take their heads right off as soon as they get to this point. This line is going to collapse here. Over on the other side, the line is laying low. They're frozen. They are stuck in place. They can't go anywhere. And if they get up, they're going to get hit by something. And even when they're laying down, exploding shells overhead are going to send the shrapnel down and possibly hit them in the back, the head, the neck, the groin, the leg. It's going to take them out. That's where a lot of the mass destruction happens here at Malvern Hill, because of that Union artillery firing and raining hell down on the soldiers that are out here. Peter Crawford Earnhardt is on that field making his way in this direction, and that is where he's headed. He's headed in all of this chaos, and he's going to get involved real quick. So I don't know if you can see this out here in this position where we're at right now, but this is a large divot in the ground, and the ground rises up over here, rises up over here, and then starts to rise over here again. Now remember, we said the Confederates are coming in from this position. They're going to end up in those woods far back, and they're going to start making their way forward. Well, in this position here, General Couch found that the uneven terrain in this section was less favorable for artillery. So he chose to push his infantry forward of the guns, placing brigades under Abercrombie, Howe, Palmer on this area to prevent the attacking Southerners from staging a successful assault. Also, to our right here, Couch's men repelled charges of D.H. Hill's Confederate division during the heat of the battle. And as the advanced Union brigades became fought out, reinforcements marched past the West House and arrived here to assist Couch and his regiments. Way back in the distance there is the West House that we're talking about. So these Confederates need to come up over here and attack the artillery positions way back there. But they can't even get to that position because we have artillery here, facing in this direction, facing in this direction. And we have Confederates that are trying to come up over the ridge line here to fight. Now this is much earlier in the fight itself. This is a pretty neat perspective to have here. Unfortunately, the woodlot here blocks any of the terrain out in that direction. or we would be able to see the rest of the battlefield off in that direction. So I like signs like this on the battlefield out here, because it gives you a "you are here" perspective, which is what I try to provide in these videos too. But if you take a look at this sign, and we'll do a slow motion pan of this sign so you can read it for yourself or take a look at it, pointing to where we're at on the battlefield. Now remember, a minute ago we talked about Couch's position, where he was at, off on the left-hand side. That high-rise position is right back here. And then they're talking about Barlow, very famous name. Remember Barlow's Knoll. We have Barlow positioned on some heights over here. Sickles is coming up down the path that we're on, another famous name in the American Civil War. And then Kearney off to the right-hand side, just behind Barlow, protecting the area from the western run. And off in front here, we have units at 7 p.m. that are just kind of disorganized for the Confederate Army. And Jackson's men are way back in the woods over here. This is another battlefield here where General Jackson makes a huge mistake in communication and moving his men. It's kind of funny because a lot of people revere him as one of the greatest fighters for the Confederacy. But early on in the war, he did make a lot of mistakes out here on these fields. And you can see right here behind me that parsonage we were talking about earlier. Unfortunately, with the government shutdown and everything going on, they are having to put this on pause. But this is one of the projects that the park's working on right now to try to restore this and keep it upright so that it doesn't crumble over time. And they do this from time to time to keep these identifiers on the field of battle up and there for the public to see. Standing in this clear, open position that I'm in right now, when you come out to Malvern Hill, there's a lot of trees all around you. But in this area is a staging area, and Robert E. Lee is basically spending most of the daytime trying to form his men in kind of an arc. So you have Jackson off in the distance over here. Some of his men are back in this direction. And then D.H. Hill is going to be back here behind this slope going downhill, and Magruder is across the street. So imagine that arc we're talking about, going forward for one of the war's largest frontal assaults, when it starts about 1:30 in the afternoon, with the artillery opening up on the artillery facing them at West House and that ridge line going across the street. Now, to give you a better understanding of what we were just talking about, here is the area we're talking about with Jackson. The West House is off in the distance here. Couch's men are placed right about there. North Carolina is in what I like to call the armpit of the road, but they're coming up from the hill behind us with D.H. Hill's men. This is a hill. It goes back down into a ravine where the western run is, and 20th North Carolina is off in that direction over there, making their way back this way to fight. Magruder's men are across the street, and they're headed in this direction right over there. And that's where that young 19-year-old man is killed across the street, the one with that face of a child that everybody talks about that was in the Ken Burns documentary, The Civil War. Now I'm about to come off from where the parsonage is, and I'm going to go down into the woodlot here where D.H. Hill's men throughout the day are. Like, they're gathering up over here preparing for battle, but they are also coming back to this point when they start to get disorganized, and they are laying low in the tree line, really hoping that they don't get hit by a cannonball or something flying in the air, because artillery is blasting over here as they're preparing for the fight too. As you can see around me here, it's probably going to look a lot like it is right now when they first get into this area. It's a peaceful wooded area, but by the time the artillery opens up, it starts to knock down trees. It starts to take the foliage out of here. The green leafy stuff that's out here that's blocking the view is probably getting thinner and thinner by the minute as the artillery is blasting through the air and taking it all down. So I have here on this paper in front of me now a list of the battles that the historian for the 20th North Carolina wrote down as being some of the battles that they were involved in. They were involved in 39 separate engagements, separate major engagements. That doesn't include small skirmishes or anything like that. But just to name a few: Gaines Mill, Malvern Hill, South Mountain, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, Bristow Station, Kelly's Ford, Mine Run, Wilderness, Spotsylvania, North Anna, Cold Harbor, Monocacy, 3rd Winchester, Fisher's Hill, Cedar Creek, 3rd Petersburg, Fort Stedman is included in that, Sailor's Creek, and then finally the surrender at Appomattox. And at that surrender in Appomattox, 72 men of the original 1,012 end up surrendering there. Out of the 72 men, only 9 of them were armed. They didn't have weapons. Of the 72 men, Peter Crawford Earnhardt would be one of them, without an arm. Didn't have weapons of any kind. It's a pretty amazing story if you really think about it. I can't think of any other stories really that are like that. Although I think that if you dig into history deep enough, you're probably going to find a lot of soldiers that ended up making it out of this war with very similar paths, but the vast majority of them had an injury of some sort, and it's documented. But for some reason, Peter Crawford Earnhardt, not documented at all. Now I'm about at the midway point of the trail that takes us to the through the woods here on the other side to the Confederate artillery that's posted up out there. And I imagine the 20th North Carolina was probably somewhere in this area at some point in time, which means Peter Crawford Earnhardt was out here in this wooded area, hanging out, waiting for the fight. Now, this isn't a kid that just got into the fight. He's been in the other engagements in the 7 Days battles. So he has seen the devastating loss. He's seen what battle does to you. He knows exactly what he should expect. But somehow, Earnhardt makes it through this fight unscathed. Don't know how. There's no record of him being wounded here at Malvern Hill or any other battlefield. But this is a pretty amazing tale. And I can't imagine being such a young man standing out here in these woods hearing the rapport of those guns over there just going off like crazy. And you really don't know what to expect when you step outside of those woods. But imagine you come on the edge of those woods and you are over where that street was. And as you look across the field, the artillery is now closer than what you thought. It's actually on a ridgeline just in front of you. You have to have a lot of nerve to want to stand there and go towards it. That's what these men were doing. Now, one of the most solemn places that you could be on a battlefield is at a grave, especially if that grave had been there since the battle itself. Here in a minute, I'm going to walk up on a position where there's a small sign, a small marker, and it tells a story about a grave that was discovered out here in Malvern Hill, likely from some soldiers that fought here at the battle and was buried hastily in a small grave. Now, there's no telling who these soldiers were with, because when they were found, there wasn't much left, but they were definitely Confederate soldiers. We are in the position where D.H. Hill's men were. So, could it have been men from the 20th North Carolina? It is a possibility. These men were removed from this field, this battlefield grave, and they were buried later on in a cemetery. So their remains were interred properly to give them a proper burial, regardless of who they fought for, because that was the nice human thing to do. So we'll flip this camera around and I'll show you the divots that are in the ground from where those two soldiers were found. Coincidentally, I, at one point in time, ended up volunteering for a National Park Ranger that was here the day that they found these bodies. Now it's going to be kind of hard to see from this position, but there is a small divot in the ground right there. Then you can see how the tree, how the dirt comes up there, and then another small depression here. That's the burial plots that we're talking about. And it says, in this sign here, reads, the depression to the right of the trail probably represents former graves of Confederate soldiers. The dead of both armies received hasty battlefield burials. Most were disinterred after the war, with the Union dead going to Glendale National Cemetery and the Confederate dead probably being removed to Richmond. These woods are historic. They and the small stream that you crossed offered welcome shelter to Confederate soldiers. Several brigades, mostly under the command of General John B. Magruder, advanced up the slope and subsequently fell back to these woods, while Union artillerists threw shells into the treetops. So remember we talked about Magruder's men being off in this area here. This is that extreme right section that we were talking about for the Confederate soldiers. And then if you go down the slope, that was the area we were at earlier where we said the 20th North Carolina and Hill's men probably were off in this direction, headed towards the West House, which is roughly out in that direction. So this attack begins probably about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, when Alabama, John B. Gordon pushes off from the woods right there in front of me, steps out onto the field, and starts to make their way across that field, along with other units. This continues to happen over and over again until it finally gets so dark that they realistically can't fight. Some men are trapped out here on this field and they're not able to make it back, and they become prisoners of war. Other men are still further trapped from the Union Army off in this direction over here. They were at a makeshift hospital at the Nelson farm. One of them was that second lieutenant we talked about. He was over there with his calf muscle removed from a cannonball that hit him in the leg as he was crossing the field. By the time this fight was over with here, the Union generals were getting together talking about what they were going to do. All of them were in agreement. They knew the Confederacy was in trouble over here. They knew that these men were disorganized, and if they hit them hard again the next day, they would probably knock the door open to Richmond. That's the way one man put it. But instead, for some reason, McClellan decides to go to Harrison's Landing. He removes the men from the action over here, takes them to Harrison's Landing, and the Confederates clearly have a superior position that they are in as a result of a decision of a Union general, not necessarily of a one battle. Because let's be real here, at the end of this battle, this was no Confederate victory. This was definitely a defeat. For guys like Earnhardt in the 20th North Carolina, he wasn't concerned about that. What he was concerned about was going across that field and then eventually making it to see another day and hopefully getting back home. Somehow, some way, he does it. He makes it all the way to Appomattox. I've said it many times before, these fields are extremely powerful. But when you step out here on these fields and you have the story of an individual soldier, and you know their history, and you know what their family became, you take that man out of the picture, and it's likely that the Earnhardt dynasty in NASCAR does not exist. And that's a pretty amazing thing to think of when you look at the history of racing. Dale Earnhardt Jr., all those Winston Cup victories, all of those championships, somebody else gets those because the young man that fights here on this field doesn't make it through the war. But because he does, the future is forever changed for something completely different. The same thing can be said for people like Patton. So, it's pretty amazing. Now, I'm a Tennessee Volunteer fan. All of you know that. You see the hat on me all the time. But today, I had to do a little bit of football sacrilegious activity specifically for this video, and I put on the Carolina Tar Heels sweatsuit to walk this field. I felt that it was only fitting, walking the path of the North Carolinians going across this field, to put something on that represents them, because this is a very important story that we're talking about here, and realistically, I guess historians do weird things. coming up on the road here now where Y sections off at Malvern Hill. There's two different roads that intersect here. Now, according to the map from the American Battlefield Trust, which is the most reliable map that I know of, this is the area that the 20th North Carolina is in. They are slightly across this road, and they are slightly off in this section over here. And they're headed directly in front of me because they have gone from this way to veer off in this direction towards Couch and the men that are facing them there. And they have to go up over the hill that, if you look behind me here, that's above my head. So this is another gentle slope before the road was put in, like this. Another gentle slope with a road that used to intersect through here was made of dirt, and they would come up over that hill and artillery is sitting on the other side. This is what the man's facing. This is what all of them are facing coming up through here. And it was a bloody situation for the 20th North Carolina. So that's the Y section back there. This is the area. Crawford's coming up. Crawford Earnhardt is heading straight up the hill there, right into the Valley of Death. And somehow he makes it out alive. Malvern Hill is one of those places where it's not glorified. People don't talk about it as much as they probably should. The struggles that happen out here with both the Union and Confederate soldiers on this field, it's just as bloody and just as crazy as the fights that happened at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville and Gettysburg, but it doesn't receive as much attention, likely because of General McClellan and his decisions. But thankfully for this battlefield, it's been on farmland forever. And so today, you can come out here to this national park, part of the Richmond Battlefield Park system, and you can kind of step back in time. And you can be a part of this field for a second and try to learn the history and understand what happened here without all of the tour buses of Gettysburg or the silly ghost stories of Yorktown and places like that. The lantern tours and the bustling hordes of people who are on vacation to buy a t-shirt. If you're a true historian and you love this stuff, this is the place for you. Battlefields like Malvern Hill and stories like Peter Crawford Earnhardt. It's absolutely fantastic. I wouldn't trade it for anything. It's the best place to be. Well, it's been great taking you around out here to Malvern Hill and talking about the artillery positions. I got to get going to my next location and do another quick video coming up here on History with Waffles. If you haven't already, hit that like button and subscribe. We'll see you out there in those fields. Until next time, this is History with Waffles.